My name is Elena Carter, and I'm 33 years old. Last spring, my parents threw my younger sister a $20,000 gender reveal. Not the kind you see on social media with a cake and a few balloons. I'm talking about a private estate, valet parking, a drone crew filming from above, and a helicopter that flew low over the property to release blue powder into the sky like some kind of announcement to the entire county. 100 guests. Catered seafood towers. A string quartet playing under white tents. It looked like a wedding, not a reveal. 6 weeks later, I told my family I was pregnant. My mother didn't smile.
She didn't hug me.
She looked across the table and said, "Don't expect the same. You chose your life." My father didn't even look up. My sister started talking about baby names like I hadn't said anything at all. And my grandmother, she just watched. Quiet.
Still.
Like she had been watching for years. What she handed me months later didn't just change my life. It broke theirs. But to understand that moment, you have to see what came before it. Let me take you back to that gender reveal. The night my entire family proved, in front of 100 people, exactly where I stood. The property sat on the edge of town, tucked behind iron gates and a winding drive lined with oak trees that had probably been there longer than anyone alive. The house itself was massive, white columns, wraparound porch, the kind of place people use for weddings they can barely afford. My parents didn't hesitate. They never do when it comes to my sister, Chloe. I stood near the back of the lawn, close to the drink table, holding a glass of something sweet I wasn't actually drinking. I was 4 weeks pregnant at the time. No one knew yet. Not because I was hiding it, but because I had learned to wait, to measure moments, to pick when something mattered enough to say out loud. The air smelled like citrus and grilled seafood. Servers moved in clean lines, refilling glasses before they were empty. Laughter came in waves, loud and easy, the kind that belongs to people who feel like they're part of something. I wasn't. My father clinked his glass, drawing attention instantly. He had that voice, the one that carries, the one people respect without questioning. "This," he said, gesturing toward Chloe and her husband, Dylan Hayes. "This is what family is about." People nodded, smiled,
Leaned in.
legacy,
Growth.
building something worth being proud of. He paused just long enough to let it land. "And Chloe, you've given us exactly that." Applause broke out.
Loud.
Immediate. Almost rehearsed. I clapped too.
Of course I did.
You learn how to do that. You learn how to perform belonging even when you're standing outside of it. The helicopter came in low, louder than expected, the wind kicking up napkins and strands of hair. People screamed, phones went up, cameras flashing, capturing every second like it mattered more than anything else happening that day. Blue powder burst into the air. The crowd lost it. My mother rushed forward, wrapping Chloe in this tight, emotional embrace that the photographer captured from 6 different angles. I heard her whisper, "My perfect girl," just loud enough for the front row to catch it. I kept clapping, smiling, holding that glass like it anchored me there. Then I looked across the lawn. My grandmother, Margaret Hale, sat alone at a small round table near the edge of the property. Her plate untouched. Her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wasn't watching Chloe. She wasn't watching the celebration. She was watching me. Not with pity. Not with surprise. Recognition. Like she had already seen this moment play out long before it happened. I looked away first. Because it's harder to hold someone's gaze when they see the truth you're trying to ignore. 6 weeks later. Sunday dinner.
My parents' house hadn't changed.
Same polished floors. Same oversized dining table that always felt too formal for actual conversation. Same smell of whatever my mother cooked mixed with that lavender candle she burned year-round like it erased everything underneath. I had the ultrasound in my purse. I had rehearsed it in my head. Not the words exactly, just the feeling.
Calm.
Simple.
Direct.
Marcus drove. As we sat in the driveway, engine still running, he reached over and squeezed my knee. "Whatever happens in there," he said quietly, "we're good." Marcus doesn't say things he doesn't mean. That's what made it worse. Because I already knew what was coming. Inside, Chloe was scrolling through her phone, showing Dylan something about custom nursery furniture. My father stood at the counter carving meat like it required his full attention. My mother adjusted plates, making sure everything looked right. Everything always had to look right. My grandmother sat at the head of the table, hands folded, waiting. We sat down. Plates filled. Conversation moved around me, over me, like I wasn't part of it. I waited until there was a pause. Then I pulled the ultrasound from my purse. I slid it across the table. "We're expecting," I said. "Due in January." My mother picked it up like it was unfamiliar, like she had to process what she was looking at. 3 seconds. That's how long it took for everything to shift. "Well," she said. She set it down, face down. "Don't expect the same. You chose your life." No hesitation. No softness. Just a statement. My father kept cutting his steak. Didn't look up. Didn't react. Like I hadn't said anything worth acknowledging. Chloe glanced at the ultrasound briefly. "Oh, congrats," she said. Then, without missing a beat, "Did I show you the Italian wallpaper we picked? It's imported. Took 6 weeks to ship." Under the table, Marcus took my hand. And for the first time since I'd known him, his fingers weren't steady. They were shaking. That scared me more than anything my mother had said. Because Marcus doesn't get shaken. He builds things. Solid things. Things that last. And in that moment, even he felt it. At the head of the table, my grandmother set her fork down. Slowly. Deliberately. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't interrupt. She just looked at my mother. A long look. The kind that doesn't ask questions. The kind that answers them. No one else noticed. But I did. Because I had spent my entire life noticing the moments no one else wanted to acknowledge. We didn't stay long.
We didn't argue.
We didn't explain. We left. Marcus didn't say anything in the car. Neither did I. We sat in the parking lot of our apartment for almost 20 minutes. Engine off. Windows cracked. The sound of traffic somewhere distant and irrelevant. I cried quietly. Not loud. Not dramatic. The kind of crying that slips out sideways when you've held everything in for too long. And the worst part? It wasn't new. That's what people don't understand. It wasn't that moment. It was the pattern, the repetition, the slow, consistent reminder that I had always been less. When I was 17, I won a statewide writing competition. My parents didn't come. That same week, Chloe placed second in a regional tennis match. They drove 5 hours to be there. When I graduated college, full scholarship, no debt, they showed up late, left early. Chloe's graduation? 3 days of celebration.
Trips.
Dinners. Photos everywhere. My wedding? 30 guests. Minimal budget. My mother complained about the color of the table linens for weeks. Chloe's wedding? 200 guests. Open bar. Live band. Fireworks. I learned early. You don't compete for attention you're never going to win. Marcus wiped my cheek with his thumb. "You don't owe them anything," he said. He was right. But understanding that and feeling it are two different things. Marcus owns his own woodworking business. Not a hobby. Not side work. A real business. 6-figure projects. Custom builds people wait months for. He creates things with his hands that last longer than most people's opinions. But my family didn't care about that. Because his last name wasn't attached to power. And in their world, that's all that mattered. What I didn't know then was that someone had been watching everything. Not just that dinner. Not just the gender reveal. Everything. Every slight. Every moment. Every silence. For decades. And she hadn't forgotten a single one. 2 weeks later, I called my grandmother. And that conversation was the beginning of something none of us saw coming. But she did. She had been waiting.
Patiently.
Quietly. For the exact moment when it would matter the most. I called my grandmother the next morning, earlier than I usually would, because something about the way she looked at me the night before wouldn't leave my head. It stayed there, quiet but heavy, like a door slightly open that I hadn't noticed before, and when she picked up, her voice sounded the same as always, calm, steady, like nothing in the world could rush her. "Elena," she said, like she had already been expecting me to call, like I was right on time for something I didn't yet understand. And I asked her how she was. I asked about her garden, the tomatoes she'd been growing, the neighbor's dog that kept digging up her flower beds, all the normal things, but there was something underneath it, something unsaid, and she let it sit there for a moment before shifting the conversation in a way that felt deliberate. "Your mother called me yesterday," she said, just like that, no build-up, no hesitation, and I felt something tighten in my chest instantly, because nothing good ever followed those words. Not in my family, not in my experience, and I asked what she wanted. Even though I already knew it wouldn't be simple, it never was, and my grandmother let out a small breath, not tired, not frustrated, just aware. "She said I should slow down my visits to you," she said, and the way she said it made it clear this wasn't concern, it was instruction, wrapped in politeness. And I stood there in my kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter, my knuckles whitening without me realizing it. "She told you not to come see me," I said, "because sometimes you have to strip things down to what they really are, no soft edges, no translation, just truth." And my grandmother didn't correct me, didn't soften it, she said the highway is dangerous for someone my age. And there it was, the kind of excuse that sounds reasonable until you hold it up to reality. Because my grandmother had been driving 2 hours to see me every month for years, through rain, through heat, through everything, and suddenly now it was unsafe. Suddenly now it was a concern, and I could feel the anger starting to build. Not loud, not explosive, but controlled, the kind that sits low and steady and doesn't go away easily. "Are you going to listen to her?" I asked, and there was a pause, just long enough to remind me who I was talking to, just long enough for her answer to land exactly where it needed to. "I am 79 years old," she said, voice flat, grounded. "I listen to whoever I choose." And just like that, something in me settled. Not because the situation changed, but because she wasn't playing along. She wasn't bending. She wasn't letting herself be moved into a position that made things easier for anyone else, and that mattered more than I realized in that moment, because it meant I wasn't the only one seeing what was happening, I wasn't the only one keeping track, and for the first time in a long time I didn't feel completely alone in it. But what I didn't know yet was how far my mother had already gone, how much she had already started rewriting the narrative before I even had a chance to respond, because a few days later, I got a call from my cousin Tara, and she didn't ease into it, she never does, she just said it straight. "Your mom's been talking about you." And I felt that same tightness again, sharper this time, because I knew what that meant, I knew the pattern, I knew how this plays out. And when I asked what she said, Tara hesitated for half a second, like she was deciding how much to give me at once. "She told everyone you don't want Grandma visiting you anymore," she said, and for a second I just stood there, not reacting, not speaking, just letting it land, because it wasn't just a lie, it was a setup. A way to position me as the problem before I even had the chance to say anything, to make sure that if I pushed back, if I corrected it, it would look like I was the one creating conflict. And I asked her who everyone was, even though I already had an idea, and she listed them: aunts, neighbors, church friends, people who would take that version of the story and hold on to it because it came from my mother. And my mother always sounded convincing. That was her strength, not truth, but delivery. And I thanked Tara, hung up, and just stood there in my kitchen, the silence louder than anything she had just told me, because this wasn't new, it was just clearer, more obvious, more direct than before, like she had stopped trying to hide it behind anything, and that scared me more than anything she'd ever said to my face, because when someone is willing to rewrite reality like that, to control the story before it even starts, it means they're not just reacting anymore, they're planning, and that realization sat with me longer than I wanted it to, longer than I was comfortable with, and it didn't stop there, because the next hit came from someone I didn't expect, my friend Jasmine, who called me in the middle of her shift, her voice tight, controlled. "You need to hear this from me," she said, and I knew immediately it was bad, because Jasmine doesn't dramatize anything, she doesn't overreact. She just tells you what is. And I asked her what happened, and she said my mother had been at a brunch, one of those gatherings where people pretend they're connecting but they're really just trading information, and she told everyone there that Marcus wasn't stable, that he didn't have a real business, that he took cash jobs and didn't report income, that I married him because I needed somewhere to go, and I closed my eyes when she said it, not because I was surprised, but because hearing it out loud made it real in a way that thinking about it didn't, because Marcus had built everything he had from nothing, every tool, every client, every contract, every late night in that workshop, and she had seen it. She had stood there and looked at it and still decided to lie about it anyway, and that kind of choice isn't accidental, it's intentional, it's targeted, it's designed to stick. And when I told Marcus that night, he didn't explode, he didn't react the way people expect, he just listened, quiet, focused, and when I finished, he nodded once, like he had already made a decision in his head. "I'm not going to tell you what to do about your family," he said. "That's your call." And he paused, just long enough for the next part to land harder. "But I'm not letting our child grow up thinking I'm something to be embarrassed of." And that was it. No anger, no yelling, just a line drawn, clear, solid, non-negotiable. And standing there in that moment, watching him, seeing the way he held himself, I understood something I hadn't fully accepted before. This wasn't just about me anymore. This wasn't just about what I could tolerate. This was about what I was willing to allow into the life we were building, and that realization didn't feel loud. It didn't feel dramatic. It felt quiet and final, like something clicking into place, and the answer didn't come from confrontation. It didn't come from some big moment where I stood up and said everything I'd been holding back. It came from something smaller, something unexpected, a piece of mail sitting on my grandmother's kitchen counter that I wasn't supposed to pay attention to, because when I picked it up, when I saw my father's name printed on it, not at his address, but hers, something shifted again, something sharper this time, because it meant he had already started moving pieces I didn't even know were on the board. And when I asked her about it, when I held that envelope up and said his name out loud, she didn't look surprised, didn't look caught off guard. She just said, "He wants me to sign something," like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. And I asked what it was, even though I already knew it wouldn't be simple, and she said it plainly. "He wants to use the house." And for a second I didn't understand, not fully, because the house wasn't just property, it was history, it was something built, something lived in, something that held more than just value. And she clarified it, calm, steady. "He wants to use it as collateral." And that's when it hit, not just what he was asking, but what he was risking. Because that house was everything she had, everything she had kept intact for decades, and now he wanted to leverage it, risk it, put it on the line for something that didn't belong to her. And I felt that same controlled anger again, stronger this time, sharper, because this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about her, about what she had built, about what they were willing to take if she let them. And I asked her if she had signed anything, and she shook her head. "Not yet," she said, and then she looked at me in a way she hadn't before, not just seeing me, but measuring something, deciding something, and she said, "I see what's happening." And there was no emotion in it, no hesitation, just clarity. And in that moment, standing there in her kitchen, holding that envelope, I realized something I hadn't fully understood until then. This wasn't random. This wasn't scattered. This wasn't just a series of isolated choices. This was a pattern, controlled, deliberate, and building towards something bigger. And whatever that something was, it hadn't happened yet, but it was coming, and when it did, it wasn't going to be quiet. Whatever that something was, it didn't wait long. It never does when people think they're still in control, because the following weekend my parents hosted their annual 4th of July barbecue, the one they throw every year like a performance, like a reset button that erases everything that came before it. 40, maybe 50 people, red, white, and blue everywhere, long tables, ribs on the smoker since sunrise. My father moving through the yard shaking hands like he owned not just the house but the narrative, and I almost didn't go. I stood in the bedroom staring at my reflection, one hand resting on my stomach, trying to decide if walking into that space again was worth it, if I had the energy for whatever version of reality they were going to present this time. But my grandmother would be there, and that mattered, so we went, Marcus driving, quiet like he always is when he knows something's coming but doesn't need to say it out loud. And the second we stepped into that backyard, I felt it, the shift, the way conversations lowered just slightly, The way eyes moved and then moved away, like everyone already knew something I hadn't been told yet, and my mother was standing near the drink table with a group of women, smiling, performing, and when she saw us, she didn't call out Marcus by name, didn't introduce him properly. She just said, "And that's Elena and her husband." Like he was an afterthought. Like his name didn't matter enough to be remembered in front of people she wanted to impress, and Marcus didn't react, not outwardly. He just nodded once, that controlled, steady nod he uses when he's choosing not to engage, and we moved further into the yard, trying to find space, trying to exist without becoming part of the show, but it didn't stay quiet for long. It never does in that house, because my father spotted Marcus near the grill and waved him over like he was calling someone up to be evaluated, and Marcus went. Of course he did, because he's respectful even when he's being disrespected, and I followed just close enough to hear it. "So what do you do again?" my father asked, like he hadn't been told a dozen times, like he hadn't seen the workshop, the contracts, the work itself, and Marcus answered simply, "I own a custom woodworking business." Calm, direct, no apology in it, and one of my father's business friends, a man in a pressed polo with a watch that cost more than my first car, leaned in slightly and said, "Oh, like a carpenter?" And my father chuckled, actually chuckled. "Well, someone's got to build the furniture," and there it was, not loud, not aggressive, just enough to land, just enough to shift the tone, just enough to remind everyone where they thought Marcus belonged in their world, and Marcus held that man's gaze for a second longer than expected, not challenging, not aggressive, just steady, and said something like that, before stepping back, before removing himself from a conversation that wasn't built to respect him, and I felt it then, not embarrassment, not shame, something sharper, something protective, because this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about him, about what I was allowing him to stand in, about the space I kept bringing him into, and it didn't stop there, because later when my sister started showing people photos of her nursery, imported wallpaper, custom furniture, everything perfect, everything curated, one of the women turned to me and asked, "What about you?" And I said the truth. "Marcus is building our crib." And there was a pause, just a second, just enough for the difference to register, and my mother stepped in immediately, filling the space with that same tone she always uses when she's smoothing over something she doesn't approve of. "Well, that's resourceful," she said, stretching the word just enough to twist it, just enough to make it sound like something less than what it was, and I didn't respond because I didn't trust myself to keep it contained if I did. And the night kept moving, fireworks, laughter, conversations that didn't include me unless they needed to, and then came the part that stayed with me, the part that didn't leave even after we drove away, the family photo. My mother called it, gathering everyone onto the porch. Like it was something meaningful, like it represented something real, positioning people exactly where she wanted them. My father in the center, Chloe beside him, Dylan behind her, the Ashfords filling out the frame, every placement intentional, every position calculated, and I stepped forward automatically, not thinking, just reacting, because I am part of that family, whether they acknowledge it or not. And she stopped me, hand up, not even looking directly at me. "Oh, honey, we'll do another one after. This is just the immediate group." Immediate group. The words landed heavier than anything else that day because I was standing right there, 6 months pregnant, visible, undeniable, and still somehow excluded from something I was supposed to belong to, and I stepped back because what else do you do in that moment? You don't argue in front of 50 people. You don't force your way into a space that's actively pushing you out. You step back, you watch, you take it in, and the camera clicked once, twice, 3 times, capturing a version of family that didn't include me, that never planned to include me, and there was no second photo, no follow-up, no correction, just that moment, sealed, documented, reinforced, and I looked over at my grandmother, sitting on the far end of the porch, hands folded, watching everything, not reacting, not interrupting, just observing, like she was adding another entry to something only she could see, and we left not long after that. Marcus, already at the car, jaw tight, eyes forward, "We're not coming back here," he said, not loud, not emotional, just certain, and I nodded because for the first time, I didn't feel conflicted about it. I didn't feel like I needed to justify staying. I didn't feel like I owed anyone the effort anymore. And we drove away in silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled, because everything that needed to be said had already been understood. And later that night, when my phone rang and I saw my grandmother's name, I knew something had shifted, not small, not subtle, something real. And when I answered, her voice was different, still calm, still controlled, but there was something under it, something firm, something decided. "I saw everything," she said, no greeting, no build-up, just truth. "Grandma, I'm fine." I started, the automatic response, the one I've used my whole life to avoid making things bigger than they need to be. And she cut me off, clean, precise. "No, you're not." And the silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was clear. It was final. It was the kind of silence that happens when someone stops pretending. "I watched your mother push you out of that photo," she continued. "I watched your father laugh at your husband. I watched your sister act like you weren't there, and I have been watching this for years. And I didn't speak, couldn't, because there was nothing to add to that, nothing to correct, nothing to defend, because she wasn't asking, she was stating." And then she said something that changed everything, not loudly, not dramatically, just steady. "I'm done being quiet." And that sentence, simple as it was, carried more weight than anything else she could have said, because my grandmother doesn't make statements like that unless she's already acted on them, unless something has already been set in motion, and I felt it then, not fear, not uncertainty, something else. Anticipation, the kind that builds when you know something is coming. But you don't know exactly what it is yet, and I asked her what she meant. Even though part of me didn't want to hear it yet, part of me wanted to stay in the space before everything shifts, and she didn't answer directly. She just said, "I've made my decision." And that was it. No explanation, no details, just a statement that closed the door on everything that had come before it. And when she hung up, I sat there staring at my phone, replaying it over and over again. I've made my decision. Because I knew her, I knew how she moved, how she thought, how she acted, and she doesn't say things like that lightly. She doesn't say things like that without already knowing exactly what comes next. And Marcus looked at me from across the room, reading my face the way he always does. "What did she say?" he asked, and I told him, and he nodded slowly, like he understood something I was still trying to process. "Then it's already done," he said. And that sentence stayed with me, because if he was right, if she had already moved, if something had already been set into motion, then whatever was coming wasn't something I could prepare for, it wasn't something I could influence, it was something I was about to walk into whether I was ready or not. And that feeling, that quiet build, that sense that something was shifting just out of reach, followed me for weeks, through everything, through the days that felt normal on the surface but carried something heavier underneath, through the nights where I lay awake longer than usual, thinking about everything that had led to this point, everything that had been said, everything that hadn't, and 4 months later, when everything finally surfaced, when everything finally revealed itself in a way none of us could ignore, I realized something that changed the way I saw all of it. She hadn't just made a decision, she had been planning it for a long time, and what she set in motion wasn't just a response, it was a correction, and the moment it landed, the moment it became real, nothing in that family would ever be the same again. For months later it landed, not loud, not explosive, not the kind of moment that announces itself with chaos. It came in quietly, wrapped in something that looked almost ordinary, and that's what made it dangerous, because I almost missed it for what it was, almost treated it like just another day, just another small event in a life that had been slowly tightening for years. And it started with a baby shower that my family didn't plan, didn't offer to host, didn't even ask about. It was Jasmine who put it together. Jasmine who booked the back room of a small cafe downtown. Jasmine who called people, arranged everything, made sure there was something warm and real waiting for me in a way my own family never did. And it wasn't extravagant, it wasn't polished, it didn't need to be. Mismatched chairs, soft music playing low, a homemade cake sitting slightly off-center on a table that had probably been used for a dozen different things before that day, flowers in mason jars that still smelled like the garden they came from, and for the first time in months, I felt something different, not tension, not pressure, something lighter, something that didn't require me to measure every word or brace for every reaction. And Marcus was there. Of course he was, moving quietly through the room, adjusting things, making sure everything held together the way he always does, and the crib he had built sat in the center, polished, solid, real, something made with intention instead of appearance. And people noticed it, not the way my family notices things, not with comparison, but with appreciation, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken loudly to be felt. And for a moment, just a moment, it felt like this was what it was supposed to look like, simple, honest enough. And then the door opened and everything shifted again, because my grandmother walked in, slow, steady, carrying something in her hand that didn't belong to the room, a sealed envelope, thick, deliberate, and the way she held it told me this wasn't casual. This wasn't something she had just brought along. This was the reason she came. And the room didn't go silent. Not immediately, but people noticed. They always do when someone like her enters a space. There's a presence to her, something grounded, something that doesn't need attention but commands it anyway. And she moved toward me without hesitation, without greeting anyone else first, without stopping, like she had already decided exactly how this was going to go. And when she reached me, she didn't hug me right away. She didn't smile. She just said, "Come outside with me." And there was something in her voice that made it clear this wasn't optional. This wasn't a suggestion. And I followed her, out onto the small porch where the air was cooler, sharper, quieter. And she handed me the envelope. Just like that. No build-up, no explanation. "Open it," she said. And my hands were already shaking before I touched it. Not from fear, exactly, but from something deeper, something instinctive, like I already knew whatever was inside wasn't small, and I tore it open, not carefully, not slowly, just enough to get to what was inside. And the first thing I saw was a document, thick paper, official, stamped, the kind of paper that doesn't get printed unless something real has already been done. And I read the first line, then the second, then the third, and my brain struggled to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. Property transfer, notarized, finalized, recorded, and then the names, my name, Marcus's name, and the address, my grandmother's house, the one my father had tried to leverage, the one that held everything she had built. And I stopped breathing for a second, just a second, because the weight of it hit all at once, not just what it was, but what it meant. And I looked up at her, searching for something, anything that would make this feel less final, less real. "Grandma," I started, but she didn't let me finish. "It's done," she said, simple, direct, like she had already said everything that needed to be said. And I went back to the envelope, hands moving faster now, pulling out the next document. And this one hit even harder, a bank statement, dated, detailed, years of entries, deposits, growth, accumulation, and the final number sitting there like something impossible, something that didn't belong to my life. Not the life I had been living, not the life I understood, millions, not thousands. Not something small, something massive, something that shifted everything it touched. And my hand started to shake harder now, not controlled anymore, not contained. And there was a third piece, folded, handwritten. And I knew before I opened it that this was the part that would hurt the most. Because numbers change your situation, but words change your understanding. And I unfolded it slowly, reading each line like it was heavier than the last, her handwriting steady, precise. Dated entries, not random thoughts, not scattered memories, a record, a deliberate record of everything she had seen, everything she had chosen not to say until now, every moment I had thought no one noticed, every time I had been overlooked, dismissed, pushed aside, and it was all there, written down, preserved, validated in a way I hadn't realized I needed until that moment. And the last part, the final lines, they settled in a way nothing else had, not dramatic, not loud, just clear. "This is not a gift, this is a correction." And I felt something break, not in a way that made me weaker, but in a way that released something I had been carrying for too long, something I had learned to live with, something I had convinced myself didn't matter. And I stood there on that porch, holding everything she had just handed me, and for the first time, the imbalance I had lived with my entire life didn't feel permanent anymore. It felt adjusted. And inside the cafe, people were watching. They didn't know what was happening, but they could see it, the shift, the way my posture changed, the way the air around me felt different. And Marcus stepped closer to the door, not interrupting, not asking, just being there, ready for whatever came next, and I walked back inside slowly, not because I needed time, but because everything had already changed and I needed to move at a pace that matched it, and I sat down, the envelope still in my hand, and for a moment, everything felt quiet again, like the kind of quiet that comes right before something else happens, and it didn't take long, because news like that doesn't stay contained, not in a family like mine, not with people like my parents, because 2 weeks later, the calls started, not one, not two, dozens, my phone lighting up over and over again, my mother's name, my father's name, messages stacking on top of each other, urgency replacing the silence they had held for months, and I didn't answer, not right away, not because I was avoiding it, but because I understood something now that I hadn't before. Timing matters, control matters, and for the first time, I had both. And when they finally showed up, standing on my porch, like they belonged there, like they had a right to be there, I saw them differently, not as authority, not as something I needed to respond to, just people who had made decisions and were now facing the consequences of them. And my mother didn't ease into it, didn't try to soften anything, she went straight to it. "We need to talk," she said, voice tight, controlled, but cracking underneath, and I stepped outside, closing the door behind me, creating a space that belonged to me, not them, and my father followed, holding something in his hand, a bag, old photos, memories used like currency, like leverage, and he started explaining, fast, too fast, about the business, about the expansion, about contracts already signed, about what would happen if things didn't go the way he needed them to, and I listened, not interrupting, not reacting, just letting him say it, because this wasn't about understanding anymore, I already understood, and then he said it, the part he had been building toward. "We need the house back." And there it was, clear, direct, no disguise left, and my mother stepped forward then, dropping whatever control she had left, emotion flooding in. "Please," she said, grabbing my hand. We didn't know she would do this, and I looked at her. Really looked, and for the first time, I didn't see authority, I didn't see control, I saw desperation. And I asked her the only question that mattered, "Which part are you sorry for?" And she froze, just for a second, just long enough. And in that second, everything became clear, not because of what she said, but because of what she didn't. And I pulled my hand back, not aggressively, not dramatically, just enough to create space again. And Marcus stepped beside me then, not speaking, not needing to, just standing there, solid, present, everything my family had tried to diminish, everything they had refused to acknowledge. And in that moment, standing between what I had been and what I had built, I realized something that had been building for a long time, something that finally made sense in a way it never had before. They didn't lose control in that moment. They had already lost it, they just didn't know it yet. And now they were standing there, trying to negotiate something that had already been decided, trying to reach for something that was no longer theirs to touch. And for the first time, I wasn't reacting to them. I wasn't adjusting, I wasn't stepping back, I was holding my ground. And that changed everything. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't slam the door, I didn't give them the reaction they were bracing for. I just stood there on that porch with Marcus beside me, and the weight of everything that had shifted sitting steady in my chest. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to manage their emotions, I wasn't trying to soften the moment, I wasn't trying to make it easier for them to hear what they didn't want to accept. I just let it be what it was, and my father stepped forward again. Closer this time, his voice lower, more urgent, like he thought proximity would change the outcome. "Elena, listen to me," he said, and I almost laughed at the word listen because I had spent my entire life listening, adjusting, absorbing, and now suddenly he needed me to do it again, and I didn't move, didn't step back, didn't step forward, just held my position, and he kept going, explaining the business again, the contracts, the numbers, the employees depending on him, the timeline closing. In the way everything would collapse if he didn't secure that collateral, and it would have worked on me once, years ago, when I still believed responsibility meant sacrificing yourself to keep everything else intact. But now it just sounded like what it was, a situation he had created, a risk he had taken, a plan he had built assuming someone else would carry the consequences, and my mother stepped in again, voice breaking, tears finally spilling over in a way that would have undone me before. "We're family," she said, like that word still held authority, like it still had the power to pull me back into a role I had already stepped out of, and I looked at her, really looked, at the mascara smudged under her eyes, the way her hands trembled, the way her voice caught on the edges of words she didn't fully believe, and I asked her again, quieter this time. Which part are you sorry for? And she opened her mouth, then closed it, and in that pause, everything settled into place, because apologies that can't name what they're apologizing for aren't real. They're negotiations, they're attempts to regain control, and I wasn't participating in that anymore, and my father exhaled sharply, frustration slipping through now. This isn't the time for that, he said, and there it was, the shift. From appeal to pressure, the tone changing just enough to remind me how this always used to go, but it didn't land the same way this time. It didn't carry the same weight because I wasn't the same person standing in front of him anymore, and I shook my head slightly. No, this is exactly the time, I said, and my voice didn't rise, didn't crack, it stayed even, controlled, the way his used to be when I was the one being corrected. And for a second, just a second, I saw it register. I saw the realization flicker across his face that this conversation wasn't going to follow the pattern he expected, that I wasn't going to fold, and my mother tried again, stepping closer, lowering her voice like we were sharing something private instead of standing in full view of the street. "We can fix this," she said. "We can work something out." And I almost asked her what fixing meant to her, whether it meant returning what had been taken, whether it meant acknowledging anything beyond what she needed in that moment, but I didn't, because I already knew the answer, and Marcus shifted slightly beside me, not stepping in front, not speaking, just enough to remind me he was there, solid, steady, everything they had dismissed, everything they had reduced, standing right beside me without needing to prove anything, and that mattered more than anything they were saying, and I took a breath, slow, deliberate, and I said it, not as a statement of anger, not as a reaction, just as truth. "You didn't lose the house today," I said, and both of them stilled, listening now in a way they hadn't before. "You lost it a long time ago." And my father frowned slightly, confusion mixing with frustration, and I continued, "You lost it when you started treating everything like it was yours to use, yours to leverage, yours to control. You lost it when you decided what I deserved and what I didn't. You lost it when you made choices assuming I would never have the ability to say no." And my voice didn't waver, didn't rise. It stayed steady all the way through, and my mother shook her head quickly. "That's not fair," she said, and I nodded once. "I know," I replied. It wasn't. And the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, heavy, settled, and my father ran a hand through his hair, something I hadn't seen him do in years, a small crack in the composure he usually held so tightly. "So that's it?" he asked. And I looked at him, not as a child looking at a parent, not as someone seeking approval, just as a person answering another person. "That's it," I said, and he stared at me for a second longer, like he was searching for something, some sign that this could still shift, that this wasn't final, but he didn't find it, because there was nothing left to give him, nothing left to negotiate, and my mother's shoulders dropped slightly, the tension in her posture giving way to something else, something quieter, something closer to realization, and she whispered, "We didn't think it would end like this." And I believed her, not because she was being honest about everything, but because I knew how they operated. I knew they had never planned for this outcome, never imagined a version of events where I wasn't the one adjusting, the one accommodating, the one stepping back, and I nodded slightly. "I know," I said, and that was the closest thing to understanding I could offer, because understanding doesn't erase what happened, it just explains how it happened, and my father took a step back then, not dramatically, just enough to create distance, like he needed space to process something he hadn't expected to face, and my mother let go of my hand completely, her fingers dropping back to her side, empty now, and for a moment, none of us moved, the air still, the street quiet, everything settled into a kind of pause that didn't need to be broken, and then Marcus opened the door behind me, not as an interruption, not as a signal, just a simple action, and I stepped back inside, not quickly, not abruptly, just a shift from one space to another. And they didn't follow, they didn't try to push past, they just stood there, and I closed the door gently, not slammed, not forced, just closed, and that was it. No dramatic ending, no final words shouted across the porch, just a quiet, definitive end to something that had been building for years, and inside, the house felt different. Not lighter exactly, but clearer, like something that had been unresolved. for so long had finally been placed where it belonged, and Marcus leaned against the counter, watching me, not asking questions, not needing explanations, just there, and I walked over, set the envelope down on the table, the document still inside, everything that had shifted our lives sitting right there in plain view, and I exhaled, a long, steady breath that felt like it had been waiting to happen. And he asked the only thing that mattered. "You okay?" And I thought about it for a second, not automatically saying yes, not defaulting to something easy, and I nodded slowly. "Yeah," I said, "I think I am." And it was true, not in the sense that everything was fixed, not in the sense that nothing hurt anymore, but in the sense that I wasn't carrying what wasn't mine to carry anymore, and that changed everything. And later that night, when the house was quiet, when the world outside had settled, I stepped out onto the porch alone, the same porch where everything had just shifted, and I stood there for a while, not thinking about what I lost, not replaying what had been said, just standing in the quiet, in a space that now felt like mine in a way it hadn't before. And I realized something then, something simple but solid. They had spent years deciding what I was worth, years defining my place, years building a version of me that fit inside their expectations, and none of it held anymore, none of it carried weight anymore, because the moment I stopped accepting it, it stopped being real. And that didn't erase the past, didn't undo anything that had happened, but it changed what it meant, and that was enough. More than enough. And inside, Marcus had already turned off the lights, the house dim, calm, steady, and I took one last look at the street, at the space where they had been standing just hours before, and there was nothing there now, no tension, no presence, just empty space, and I went back inside, closing the door behind me, not as an ending, but as a continuation of something new, something that didn't include waiting, didn't include proving, didn't include shrinking to fit into something that was never built for me in the first place, and for the first time, that felt like enough.